Thank you, Commissioner Sala, for responding. Welcome to an event, I would say a very important event, and I'll tell you why it's important, but let me start by introducing myself. My name is Alan Maleche. I wear a number of hats and I will say them in order of priority. I'm a research assistant at the O'Neill Institute, also an LLM law student, pursuing national and global health, but in my normal life, I work in Kenya for an NGO called KELIN that focuses on health and human rights. Today, you are either lucky or unlucky to have me as your moderator for the day, alongside a very trusted and able colleague, Isabella Barbosa, who is a senior associate at the O'Neill Institute. And we will be having a conversation for an hour and a half around what are the emerging issues on the right to health, the perspectives from Africa, and the Inter-America Commission on Human Rights. We have colleagues in the room, and we also welcome the colleagues online. Why I say this convening is important because it's a first of its kind. The Inter-America Commission and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights just concluded a conversation a week ago in Pretoria, where they agreed to find ways to work jointly to promote South-to-South learning. So inevitably, this is the first panel post that convening in Pretoria that is demonstrating indeed we can have the South-to-South learning, where we have commissioners from the Inter-America Commission and commissioners from the Africa Commission, but also involving non-state actors in form of civil society and in form of the academia. So this is actually possible, and I'm glad that O'Neill, KELIN, Dula Omar, the African Commission, the Inter-America Commission, and the Global Legal Innovation Center is really driving this conversation forward. So this is a conversation we're having today. We want to see, are there emerging issues around the right to health? Are there issues that are similar between the Americas and the Africa region? And we also want to bring into the conversation, we've got colleagues also here. I must also recognize the presence of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa, who is part of the audience with us today, Commissioner Salanje. They are here for an academic visit hosted by the O'Neill Institute to see what levels of collaboration can happen between the commissions and O'Neill, but also broadly the commissions and Georgetown University, because we see that parity. So really excited to have this event. I'm not going to read out the full bios of all the panelists, but you may have seen in your invite, we are joined closer to me by Professor Oscar Cabrera, who is the Director of the Health and Human Rights Initiative at the O'Neill Institute, and has also closely worked with the Inter-America Commission on a number of things and has done a lot of work in Latin America and also globally on the right to health. We look forward to his intervention. Next to him is our Commissioner Julissa Mantilla Falcon from the Inter-America Commission on Human Rights, who's also serving as a Special Rapporteur on the rights of women. So another win for Georgetown. You've got two special rapporteurs on women's rights issues in the same room at the same time, discussing important issues on the right to health. And then most importantly, we have Commissioner Madford Mwandega, who is the chairperson of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. He's also a commissioner at the African Commission and is from Zambia. So this will serve as our panelists, and it'll be I and Isabel that will shoot the questions, and we hope they will give us answers that will excite us, get us into conversation, get us agitated to want to discuss how do we make the right to health a reality. I promise after this, I won't do much of the talking. It'll be more of Isabel. But allow me to start off just to break the ice with our first question. And I'll start off, they say ladies first. I'll start off with Commissioner Julissa and say, in a minute, could you just tell us what inspires you to be a commissioner to fight for women's rights? And what do you think has been your greatest win on the right to health in your career? In a minute.
Hello, good afternoon. Very easy question, very easy. Well, actually, We use more than 1 minute, sorry. Well, what inspired me to be a commissioner, I will change it, or what inspired me to be a human rights lawyer and a feminist, no, because I started working on these issues since the beginning of my career. I can tell you that the first experience, I used to work in Peru in the ombudsperson, dealing with the case of forced sterilization and sexual and reproductive rights. And then I was working as well in Peru some years after that in the Truth Commission, dealing with the cases of sexual violence against women in the period of violence. So what I really inspired me is to see how your career, in this case law, is not only something that you study, or you learn, or you write, but it also could be a tool for changing people's life, and specifically in the case of women and girls. So when I arrived to the commission 4 years ago, and I was telling my colleagues before, people expect me to be the rapporteur on rights of women, but we were talking about that, and I asked to be the rapporteur on older people and the rapporteur on migrants, because I'm convinced that you can incorporate a gender perspective in any work in general in human rights. And concerning migrants, and I will go answering the second part of your question, concerning migrants, it was important to highlight what was going on with women that have to migrate, especially women from Venezuela. It was one of the crises that we assume. Women from Venezuela, when they decide to migrate, it's not only that they have to go with their children, and they also always try to travel with the contraceptive pills because they knew they're going to be raped. So at least they don't want to get pregnant. So this is a gender important issue that was not always in the public policy on that. Other cases that we learned went from people in Chile that told us that women from Venezuela living in Chile, migrants, when they were going around, they cut their hair because they have beautiful hair, and people cut their hair in order to sell the hair. Or sometimes they put ads about, we need women from Venezuela in general to sell their hair. So they went there, and it's a way to capturarla for the trafficking, for trafficking. It's like a trap for trafficking. So these kind of things, it was approved, and only a few examples about gender in the migrant situation. And the other rapporteurship that I was, the older people, I focus on older women. Because if we think about gender and women's rights, we have to think about the continuity. What happened with girls? They were educated to serve the family, to care, you know, and they grow up thinking that this is their obligation. So at the end of the day, with this girl became an older woman, she spent her whole life taking care of everybody without a pension, without a social security, without anything. And linked with that, it was the case of sexual violence. That is a topic that I've been working for a while. Now you have new laws, no? For instance, you're raped during the marriage by your husband, you have the right to denounce. I don't say that always happens, but at least you have the right to denounce. So think about women that are 70 now. What happened when they were younger? The law didn't allow them to file a complaint. So I always say that the older women now is the girl that never can complain. So these two rapporteurs, and now I'm the rapporteur on women and truth, memory, and justice. And this was a possibility to work not only in the commission outside, but inside the commission. There are a lot of changes. What inspired me, I don't want to spend more time, but I was part of the first women's board in the commission. I was the vice president. And if I can share my own story, because I'm Peruvian, I'm from Lima, but my family are from the countryside. My grandmother is Quechua hablante. She spoke Quechua, you know, and my grandparent as well. So this is another way to understand the diversity of women. We are all women, we are different. So being the granddaughter of a Quechua family, to be here as the vice president, and now last year the president, is an inspiration for myself, but for other children, for other girls as well. So, and finally, the biggest success on sexual and reproductive rights, on health rights, I cannot answer because I think that the bigger success is coming all the time.
Great, you've really put the bar high with all the things you've done and you still say success is not there, then I think many of us are in trouble. Commissioner Mwandega, what inspires you? And
Thank you very much, Alan. To begin with, what inspires me is the urge to help people realize their rights. When I was admitted to the bar, that is as far back as 1982, sure some of you were not yet born, I took up the challenge to work for the legal aid department in Zambia because I felt that certain categories of individuals could not access services provided by lawyers simply because they were indigent. And as a result of that, I felt that perhaps it could be a good idea that I kick off my practice as a legal aid counsel. And that gave me pleasure to work as a legal aid counsel. And despite all the problems that we used to have as a legal aid counsel, I still find it quite fulfilling. Now, that base is the one that has kept me going because I still believe that there are quite a number of people who do not have the chance to exercise their rights simply because they cannot afford legal counsel. And as a result of that, I have been propelled to try and see how I can assist. Because it always beats me. In my country, for instance, you find that those of us who have been practicing law do not feel like taking up these cases which involve human rights cases, simply because we are driven by profits to handle most of these cases. What is important for us as lawyers is the billable hours. And in the process, even if somebody has got a very good case, then simply because you think that that person cannot pay your bills, then you shun from taking up those particular cases. So for me, I think the urge to assist people realize their rights is that inspires me to do the work that I'm doing. In terms of the greatest wins in relation to the right to health, I can say that, again, because of my desire to be of service to humankind, I am a member of the Lions Club in Zambia. And one of the projects which we advocated was the establishment of a clinic in a far-flung area outside Lusaka. And we mobilized the funds, and at the end of it all, we managed to set up a maternity wing at that particular clinic. So for me, that project sits very well with me because at the end of the day, we're taking health facilities to a rural area, which did not have those facilities for quite some time. And the greatest thing that I did at that particular project was to have been given the responsibility and honor to be the person that had to hand over that project to the government of the Republic of Zambia so that the government can take over the facility. That to me was one of the greatest wins in my experience in trying to actualize the right to health in Zambia. Thank you.
Thank you. 41 solid years of legal practice. Indeed, some of us are not even at the 40 age decade, but really inspiring, and also quite foreseeing that as the chairperson of the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee, you're already trying to get accessibility to healthcare services with the project. So I'll turn over to Oscar to hear his quick intervention on this.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Commissioner. This is a hard act to follow. So on your experience and things you have achieved. And I'll start a little bit different, because what inspires me is that when I graduated law school, I wanted to do human rights, but then I went to practice at a law firm, and we had corporate clients, right? I remember one of the big first cases that I was engaged in was with a pharmaceutical company that I'm not going to name, but they came up with one of the COVID vaccines, if people want to look into that. And seeing how much power corporate actors have to really position their interests and defer their interests in society. Our work was to expand patent protection, to go even beyond the number of years that the legislation was giving them to kind of have that exclusivity on the production of the medicine. And that, I think, was what inspired me to say, why don't we do this on the other side, which is what I always wanted to do. Why don't we use legal systems and law as a tool for social change to improve access and to really create more equal conditions in society? And that's when I left the law firm. They still pay me to go to New York and do my studies. And I went to Toronto and then never went back to a law firm. I hope they still like me, but I never went back after they gave me 2 years to be abroad. So I think that's where kind of started this work. How can we strengthen the work of the legal community? How can we really work as lawyers in a space that at that point was really crowded with economists and physicians and public health experts? So then I'll bring back to the second point, which is what I'm proud of in terms of wins. We can look at specific cases, issues, policy reform that we've been engaged in, but what I'm really proud, I think, which is a big victory, this is gonna sound self-serving, but I'm being honest, is this institute. I joined the O'Neill Institute when it was being created. We were like 5 people then. I was the weird Latin American that came from Venezuela, but I'm from Latin America and coming from Toronto. Who is this guy that didn't went to a law school, doesn't have a JD, doesn't have an SJD? It's a very strange first hire. And I always thank John Monahan, which is executive director then of O'Neill. And then I was given the opportunity to serve as executive director and then run the institute and build it as a place in which we can have a lot of you here, right? A lot of people that have been trained by Georgetown. This is a complete different space from what it was in 2007 or 8 when I joined O'Neill. Now we have lawyers that have expertise on different health issues. NCDs is no longer something weird that people say, what is a non-communicable? Why do we talk about tobacco and human rights? Why? And that, I think, for me, it's a big win, just creating the space in the community. This is not a race. We're never going to reach a point in which we're going to say, oh, we have states have accomplished all of the responsibilities when it comes to fulfilling the right to health. It's always going to be a work in progress, but creating the mechanisms and having the capacity and human capacity across the world, not just in the US, to do this work, it's very important. And that's why we also turn into partnerships with local universities, local NGOs, because the idea is not just one institute in DC, but that capacity is replicated throughout the region. One other thing that I would say is that this whole idea of centers and institutes that have an impact outside the university, that Georgetown Law took as their mission also to support this type of institutes so we can really kind of translate this into impact in society. Very important research, academic work, but always translated into society. I think it's a key issue, and it's not a win on health. It's a process in which we're all part, and we can move the needle forward when it comes to
Okay, so I'll be posing the second question to the commissioners, but before doing so, I would also like to encourage the audience, if you have any questions, if you want to write them down, we'll be taking questions in a moment. So my co-conspirator and I are getting the ball running, but we'll come back. Excuse me. So as you all know, we're gathered here today to talk about emerging issues on the right to health. And I always joke that this topic has never been so popular as in the past few years because of COVID. Of course, all of us have been thinking about health issues and living through a lot of health issues as societies and as a group. So in this context, we're curious to know the role of both commissions in relation to COVID-19, in relation to the pandemic, and particularly guiding states in their response. and whether there are some key lessons that you learned that you would like to share with the group. So I don't know who would like to go first, but it's open to both of you, please.
Thank you, Isabel. Well, actually, a few comments before, when the pandemic appeared in our life, we know that changed everything. And in the case of Latin America, we have these strong structural inequalities. And we have health services that was working very bad. And we have a lot of people in poverty. So it was this general situation. So when the COVID started, the Commission main focus was, first of all, the impact, of course, of COVID in the human rights people, especially economic, social, and cultural rights. But the other thing was the impact on democratic process and human rights in general. Because as you may remember, when the first reactions of the state was to, first of all, decree a state of emergency. No, traditionally, a state of emergency, you have to have an objective, a date, a deadline. But now was general state of emergency without a deadline. So it could become, and in some countries become, like a general situation, a state of emergency. And the other thing that we observe, of course, is that the state start giving some mandatory norms, mandatory isolation, mandatory, conditions. You cannot close everything, school and everything. So all of that has a lot of impact on human rights in general. So the Commission first measure was to create it as ACHPR COVID-19, this special group in the Commission to focus specifically on the situation in COVID. And this group, and this was one important lesson, was that the Commission usually we meet with lawyers, no? But now we start meeting with doctors, sociologists, anthropologists, because we have to understand all the impact there. And the other thing that we did is with a special rapporteur on REDESCA, there's a special rapporteur on economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights, to compile all this information that we have. We start having a lot of cases and petitions. For instance, people who were, because the traditional view was migration is, okay, you have to escape your country, so you're a migrant. But in these cases, we have professionals or people in general who were, spending 2 months in Costa Rica doing an intern. They were not allowed to come back home. So they became people in human mobility. No, the second lesson was that these new things coming from the pandemic, the Commission has to have an answer. And the other lesson, that is something that you learn and you study in your books about the indivisibility of human rights. We all know that. But now it was the major proof that this is true. But even in dictatorships, when you have a dictator, they control your life, but they never forbid people to go outside home. And now you cannot go outside home. So it was a total change on that. And this indivisibility of human rights that we already know, as I said, theoretically, that's true, really, it's true. Because health has the reason to control everything. So our reaction was to answer to all these petitions. And we have our own staff, because we are own staff that live in Washington, their families are at home, they cannot go back, they cannot travel. Some of them were in their country because on holidays, and they cannot come back to the Commission. So we have to develop internal responses for our staff, and also for, in general, the guidelines that we draft. First of all, we passed Resolution 1/2020. It's a very important resolution. It was elaborated after all these meetings that I mentioned with specialists in different areas. And it has two parts of the resolution. The first part was a review of the general condition of human rights, principle of non-discrimination, a state of emergency, why they're important to know the limit of the state of emergency. And the second part was a group of specific recommendation for the state concerning people in situation of vulnerability. Women, older people, Afro-descendant, indigenous people, LGBTQI, and so it was very important because nobody knew at that time how to react before the pandemic. Nobody knew about that. So the Commission has to use the international standard and all the meeting and have this resolution. And this resolution has a very important impact because national courts use the resolution of the commission for some cases and also for public policy. That was the first resolution. The second resolution was for 2020 concerning human rights of people with COVID. You know, you have right to privacy, your confidentiality of your results, and also this difficult decision that the state has. For instance, I have to choose who I'm going to put in a clinic. If I have an older person, I have a young people. This kind of difficult situation, the commission respond with this resolution. Then we have another resolution concerning vaccines and the access of people without discrimination. So our work was, just for closing this, to evaluate the situation, to compile information about this specific sacroid, the specific room, to pass the resolution, to monitor the impact of the resolution, and to start to analyze what's going on in our thematic rapporteur. For instance, I was the rapporteur on migrants at that time, so we have these new cases of human mobility. Another case was that people were scared around the world. People were scared, and there was not enough vaccines, and there were enough masks, there was not enough anything. So start a lot of xenophobic in the countries. They say, I have meetings with people who say, okay, but I pay my taxes. Why they're going to give masks free for these people that is illegal, you know? And what I always say is that the virus, the COVID, didn't ask you for your passport. So if you are illegal or not legal, regular, irregular, you have COVID and you're with a person with COVID, they're going to be contagious. And other thing that was analyzed, and that was the situation, the economic social rights. We have cases of Venezuelan women, for instance, that they were in this situation, and the owners, los landlords, los dueños de la casa, landlords, yeah, they asked these women, these migrant women, to have sex with them in order not to evict them. So because it was panic wherever you go. So the commission has to be, you know, like that with all this group. We have the group of vulnerable older people that they were afraid. In many countries, older people were afraid. And the other thing that we have to analyze in our work is that, for instance, we all start using Zoom, no? Meetings, students, you are young, digital, you know. But what about older people? For instance, older professors that never ever use this Zoom and digital thing. They have to keep giving classes through Zoom or any other platform without knowing how to do that. And on the other hand, many governments start giving bonus or economic help for their nationals. So what you have to do is just only enter the platform of the bank and get your bonus on your support. Yeah, tell me about older people. They don't even have computers. They don't know how to write down. It's complicated, you know. Another thing that we have to understand is about the social community. Many older people, a lot of them, go to the bank because it's a way to go out, go to the pharmacy, go to the supermarket, is their routine. You know, with the pandemic, they start being so isolated. And what about homeless people? What happened with homeless people? And this is something that we learn about the importance of the visibility, because many measures where you have to wash your hands every day. Okay, I don't have water. You cannot go out of your house. Yes, if I don't go out to sell in the street, I'm going to die. You cannot visit your older people. Okay, I live with my mom and I have to go out to work, and if I come back, I'm going to contagiarla. So this situation. And finally, in the specific group, something that I would like to highlight is how important is to have a gender perspective wherever. Because many countries as Panama, Colombia, Peru, they start saying, okay, Monday, Wednesday, men go out. And Tuesday and Friday, Saturday, women go out. And I say, how we're going to do that? For instance, what happened with trans women? And we have complete, okay, I'm a trans woman, but my ID say that I'm biological male, so which day I'm allowed to go out? So states didn't know how to answer to that. And many women, for instance, and this is something that we found, is that many women not only have to start working on this by Zoom, but also take care of the education of the children. That's why, and there's a lot of report on that. In the case of academic women, start publishing less because they don't have time to write. And the figures of sexual violence and domestic violence increase dramatically. And I always say that it's obvious, nobody knows how to control the pandemic. Nobody knows. But you know that usually children, girls, and teenagers are raped in their houses. If you say that they cannot go out, they're going to keep raping there. Who is taking the figure or the data about the pregnant woman after the isolated mandatory isolation? You know, girls, you know. So all these things have to be in mind of the public policy. And the other thing, and I'll finish with it, is the consequences of that. The consequences of women being subjected to this domestic violence or to supporting the family the whole time. The consequences of teenagers being raped or get pregnant. What happened with LGTB people, or trans men or trans women who have to interrupt their treatments because of the pandemic? What about, and this is the other thing, the intersectionality thing, because when people say, okay, you don't go out for school, but you can go by internet, come on, how many people in Latin America or indigenous people have access to internet? So the gap between indigenous people and Occidental people were like that, and with the pandemic is like that. So, and this is the other thing that we should keep in mind, and we are keeping in mind in the Commission. How are we going to deal with this enormous gap? Now, there are countries where people, the student has to finish the school like that. Okay, doesn't matter, 1 year, okay, 2 years, okay, you finish your school because of the pandemic. So what's going on after that? So it was the measures, the situation, and the impact.
Thank you, Commissioner Mantilla. I think you did a wonderful job at illustrating how COVID has really exacerbating a lot of existing inequities in our societies, and also how the Commission responded to that situation. I think all of us in the Americas, we heard of the resolutions, and especially as you pointed out, how national courts were looking to the Commission for guidance and for advice, and how the timely reaction from the Commission really allowed for a better response in the region. So thank you for that. And over to you, Commissioner Mondenga.
Thank you very much. Well, I think everybody agrees that when the COVID pandemic came into existence, I think the entire world was taken by surprise. The entire world was not ready for what happened. And as a result of that, our lives, social lives, our work, everything that we were doing was disrupted. And as a result of that, I think we noticed a situation where there was literally a breakdown of everything that was happening around. For the Commission also did realize that indeed there were quite a number of things which had changed because of the COVID pandemic. And we saw that there were also a lot of violations of human rights as a result of states trying to enforce the regulations which they had put in place to try and curb the COVID the pandemic. Of course, it was necessary that states should come up with regulations, but I think the extent to which they wanted to regulate the lives of their people during the pandemic, in most cases, they went overboard, and there were a lot of the violations which were recorded. And indeed, those violations took place, and the states themselves also put in a lot of draconian measures which they thought were going to curb the spread of the COVID violation. What worried us most was the fact that a lot of human rights violations came into existence as a result of states trying to do so. And during that particular time, the commission had occasion to issue a number of press releases between January 2020 to July 2020, talking about our perspective of the COVID situation. Some of the press releases related to where we were warning about the need for a human-based approach to the response to COVID-19. Then there was also a press release which we were talking about elections in Africa, how they were to be held during the COVID period. But above all, the commission didn't stop at that. On the 7th of August 2020, the commission passed resolution 449 of 2020, which made extensive recommendations as to how the COVID situation was to be dealt with. And those recommendations were to states parties. They dealt with a varied number of issues, which included what measures the state should put in place, what measures shouldn't be put in place, how law enforcement was supposed to be done by the authorities that were purportedly enforcing COVID regulations. And to me, that was a very extensive document, which if states had taken heed of the contents, then most likely, most of the violations which were being reported would not have taken place. And in addition to making recommendations to states, the commission also made recommendations to the AU as to how they were going to proceed under that particular resolution. But all in all, despite the efforts that we did as a commission to try and, inverted commas, bring sanity in the regulation of COVID, we still got to a situation where excesses were still being reported. And seemingly, there was nothing that the states could do about it, but which we think that that was not the right way of going. So that teaches us quite a number of lessons, this same pandemic. First and foremost, one of the greatest things which I think we learn is the fact that there is need for us as a people, as a world, to be ready for pandemics, because nobody had expected this pandemic. And it would appear as if it really took us by surprise to the extent that we did not do what to do. So from us, I think the lesson that we must learn is the fact that we must be prepared for pandemics. This is not going to be the last pandemic that is going to visit us. And it's not the first pandemic that has visited us anyway. There are others which have been there and others are still going to go. So what we now require is to be prepared for the future pandemics. Then the other lesson, I think, which we also learned from this is the fact that after the disruptions of the activities which took place, I think with the passage of time, we got to realize that it was not absolutely necessary to shut down all operations. We had to find a way of how to continue existing, how to continue doing our things. Otherwise, if we had continued with the total lockdown, a lot of countries would have collapsed, so to speak. But then with the passage of time, we got to a stage where we now realize we can do things better.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Mondenga. You raised a very important point, which is the balance between public health measures and human rights, and how that plays out in the context of the disruption of social fabric, right? So thank you very much for illustrating that and for showcasing all of the measures that the African Commission took in that context. I'm gonna pass the word to Oscar for a quick reaction as well.
Yes, it's interesting when we hear that we were not prepared, and that's true. Like our societies, our countries, at the global level, regional, national level, we were not prepared. But whose failure is that? This is nothing new. 2003, we even have a same coronavirus or different version of a coronavirus outbreak in Canada, in Hong Kong. We had a recent, it's been not even 20 years. We have had this in the past. And I think this is one of the issues, and I apologize for those of you that have heard me say this before, that we need to really focus on that preventative dimension of the obligations that arise from the right to health. That is a clear obligation. We need to create conditions to make sure we have to have the legal preparedness is a concept that we keep talking about. Global health security, it's a concept that comes and goes depending on what is the outbreak, pandemic, virus that we're discussing. Globally, it was Ebola, Zika, I don't know, chikungunya, we have like dengue. I mean, there's always a debate around infectious diseases and the impact that they have in society. Hopefully this opportunity of a global virus that really affect all countries in the world will open that window of opportunity for significant reform that is centered around human rights. If we looked at the global reforms post the SARS outbreak in Canada in 2003, human rights was very small. There was reference to human rights, but it was not front and center. If we can really build a cohesive response, having human rights frameworks be at the center of the response, maybe we'll be better prepared to try to mitigate the impacts of something that we know we cannot control. I mean, globalization is key, and you, Commissioner Mantilla, mentioned that. I mean, a virus won't stop at our border because the US has more resources than Mexico. So I think that idea of really putting human rights front and center, but using the opportunities, right now there's political will, maybe there's a very small window of opportunity because then states are gonna go back to business as usual. We're already talking about the post-pandemic world. Are we really in a post-pandemic world? We're gonna leave the pandemic world become like a chronic condition that we're all gonna live with this for longer. So in that context, putting human rights front and center might help build cohesive responses that really mitigate the impacts outbreaks have on the most vulnerable. At the end of the day, even if infectious diseases tend to be social equalizer for a little bit because they affect across socioeconomic status, we hear of a lot of examples of how it has this different, more exacerbated impact on people that are in conditions of vulnerability. And we really need to put human rights front and center in building the new mechanisms for that response, and not just national security, self-interest, which is what mobilizes some of these reforms. But just wanted to kind of
Thanks. So COVID indeed was a cross-cutting issue, though it was a pandemic that was viral in nature, but it did affect many other things that the panelists have talked about. So we are moving to another issue, not emerging, but very recurrent in our lives. It's around sexual reproductive health and rights. And I think we all, for those of us who are in the US, we all have heard about the abortion pill rulings. One state has ruled that FDA should not be able to prescribe or approve the drug. A different state has ruled in a more positive way. The Supreme Court has told us to wait for the next 5 days that it makes a decision. The same Supreme Court that overturned a very important decision on Roe versus Wade that has been the subject of conversation over the years. So we are shifting briefly to that, and then we'll open up to have a conversation with you. And for this particular question, we want Commissioner Yulisa to take us back into memory lane and tell us about this case of Beatrice versus El Salvador, which we are meant to understand was the first case regarding abortion. What's its relevance? What was it about? And in light of what's going on globally on abortion issues, what are we learning from it?
Thank you. I'm sorry, but before I answer, I like to comment something about what Oscar was saying, because of course, I was thinking about other areas that have to have a human rights perspective, like intellectual property. What about vaccines? Okay, I create the vaccines, it's my creation, so I have the right to charge what as much as I want. Or I'm a country with a lot of resources, so I'm going to buy all the Pfizer's vaccines and I will give the other vaccine for a lot of things to do. But anyway, Thank you. Concerning the question, just a little context, This is the case Beatriz against El Salvador. The commission has the possibility to receive petition and cases, also to monitor human rights situation. So we have several reports, especially in 2018 and 2021, in the case of Salvador, because El Salvador, you have it's okay. Even though your explanation before, as I was saying, Salvador has a total ban on abortion. Okay, even a natural miscarriage, if a woman has that, is going to jail. So there is no way that the woman has survived the situation without going to jail or. Anyway, this was the context in Salvador. The commission several cases, several times has asked in Salvador to modify this regulation. And this deal with another tendencies that we see now, is a regression concerning human rights of women, especially sexual and reproductive rights. It's not only a casual thing, it's a tendency, and we are very concerned about it. What happened with Beatriz? Beatriz was a young woman. She has a baby, and she was 1 year old, and she was pregnant with an anencephalic fetus, and she has lupus. So the doctor said to her that it was very difficult and very bad for her health to continue with the pregnancy, and she wants an abortion. She complained and she asked for an abortion. But the doctor didn't want that. She has to do like an amparo. She asked for precautionary measure for the commission and the court. And at the end of the day, the judges, and this is a good question, what are the judges doing concerning women's rights to health, women's body? Well, the judges didn't allow her to have the abortion. At the end of the day, her health was very bad because she has lupus. So the doctors decide to give her to have a cesarean, C-section, a C-section. So she has an anencephalic fetus who survived 4 hours. So the question was, at the end of the day, why to push things like that when she was very bad? She was very afraid because she has another baby. She wants to have the abortion and to go to take care of the other baby. So the question is, why to wait until she was very bad to have the C-section? When the case arrived to the commission and we went to the court, there was some argument that the state said. The state of Salvador said that it was not true, that it was a total ban on abortion because there are some exceptions. Actually, when you have exception in criminal law, it doesn't mean that there is not a typification of the law. This is a crime. Maybe you have a section or not, but this is a crime still. So it was not true that you don't have a total ban on abortion. Second, it's a total ban that have, of course, an impact on women and girls, but also in the health system, because many doctors consider that it was necessary to have an abortion, but they are afraid of going to jail. So that's why they don't execute the abortion. Even though they recommend the abortion, they cannot execute that because they are afraid of it. The third consequence was that many women have abortions in a clandestine way because they are afraid and they die. But the other thing is that many women, they are pregnant, but that risk pregnancy with risk, they decide not to go to the doctor because they are afraid. Some cases women went to the doctor and the doctor know that she has a risk, pregnancy and risk, and they're following her. So many women has the problem with their sexual and reproductive health, and they die as well. When we went to the court, well, the first argument, as I say, the state, they say that there was not a total ban. There is. The state say that it was a way to protect the unborn child. And the commission say that you have to have a proportionality test. Is this measure, the total ban on abortion, is really protecting the right to life? And commission conclude that it's not like that. The total ban of abortion is not protecting the life, and it has a disproportionate impact on women because, as I mentioned, women that go for the clandestine die in the way. And another thing that we strength is that this case is following previous cases on the Inter-American Court, like the Artavia Murillo case against Costa Rica, when the court decided that the protection of life is incremental. The state said that it was a mistake, but this was the case law. And there was another case law, Manuela against El Salvador, this woman who was in jail because of the miscarriage. The thing is that, and the other thing that I forgot to mention, the punishment for these women are among 10 and 30 years in jail. Even because a natural miscarriage, you can go 10 or 30 years in jail. So this is the argument of the commission. We argue that the total ban on abortion, first of all, is discriminatory, it's going against women, it's put women and girls in risk, and it's not protecting the life of anyone. It's not protecting, putting a woman 30 years in life, it's not protecting the life of anyone. And also the commission argued that it's better to increase the sexual services for women. Like Oscar was talking about prevention, no? To increase the access to sexual, education and sexual service, health services to prevent this situation. We also argue in our statement, all the international human rights law in tribunal, European Tribunal and United Nations arguments, and the total tendency is that the total ban on abortion is not something, is going against the international human rights law. It has a negative impact. And at the end of the day, when you forbid is this situation in Salvador is punishing women, doctors, judges, policemen, everybody is afraid. Everybody's afraid of going to jail. And this, just finally, this is the argument that we have about democracy and human rights in general has to deal with women. When you see these regressive tendencies, there are specific, and this is in our monitoring in the region, is mainly this regression is women's rights, especially abortion, and LGTB rights. When you have this argument consistent, there is something else. It's not only the protection of life. Thanks.
Well, what you're speaking about years ago is actually a reality that's happening in possibly many states here, where there are people pushing for total bans on abortion, pushing for lack of access to important life-saving medication like methotrexate. And I think it continues to be an emerging issue and an area of concern where we seem not to want to appreciate, to allow women to make choices, informed choices about their bodies. I think you've heard a lot from us throwing questions, I'm sure, on this side and also online. There may be questions you want to ask on. Probably there are more emerging issues than you know than us that you want to push questions to Oscar, so the floor is open. I see two colleagues, Ebenezer, and then Francesca, and then Irene. So let's take those three and then we get a response and see whether we can take another round. Over to you, Ebenezer.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to the commissioners. I think I have about two questions. My first question relates to the issue of vaccine mandate during the COVID pandemic. It was a serious also issue that some states, some segments were pushing for mandatory vaccination in order to curb the spread of the pandemic. So I wanted to know from the Inter-American perspective, what was the stand of the Inter-American Commission regarding that, and at the same time, the stand of the Afghan Commission in relation to a vaccine mandate. And the second issue has to do with self-managed abortion, which is also an emerging issue. Is there any position, or the Inter-American Commission has taken any position regarding that, or the Afghan Commission has taken any stand regarding that as well? Yes.
We'll take to Francesca and then Irene.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting discussion so far. I'm curious to know, I think one critique that's often made about kind of law and legal standards is that it's not keeping up quickly enough with changes that are helping with, you know, emerging technologies. I'm thinking about telehealth, for example, or these kinds of emerging issues that are really changing the healthcare landscape. And I'm curious about what steps the respective commissions are taking to make sure that they're keeping up essentially in organizations that may move slower sometimes than the technology. So thank you.
Irene?
Thank you very much. The first two speakers have actually addressed my two questions about issues of consent to be vaccinated and the issue of teleconsultations, especially for family planning purposes and for women. But I would like to supplement what Honorable Commissioner Mondigat discussed earlier about the measures that were taken by the Commission, and to add that we also had two conferences on the impact of the COVID-19 on the rights of people living with HIV, because we realized that some of the responses on COVID-19 also affected the responses that had already existed for HIV. So we had two conferences back to back at the regional level. And during these conferences, we addressed issues relating to women, children, refugees, migrants, and other vulnerable groups. So I just wanted to add that. And also to add also the fact that apart from the thematic resolutions, we also had country resolutions, specifically on, I think it's resolution against Cameroon. Let me just check the reference. Resolution 442, which also dealt with the deteriorating human rights situation in Cameroon during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you for those interventions. Over to the panel. Tell us about vaccine mandates, self-managed abortion, and the usual critique that the law moves too slow with regards to technology.
Okay, it's good to be first, just for a change. Well, in general, about the position on abortion. Actually, our position is to respect autonomy and to follow the Inter-American standards. In this case, Artamia Murillo case is the leading case of the Inter-American system concerning the protection that's incremental. But other than that, we have a press release when we establish that total ban on abortion is against human rights law, human rights obligation. Actually, the political, Human Rights Committee, United Nations, in the General Observation 36, do all this analysis on that and establish as well, the total ban is against human rights. We think that the way that the state, regulate abortion, the Commission cannot say to the state, you have to do that and that and that. But what we can say is that to review this regulation, and is it against human rights, women, and is a discriminatory practice, for instance, we have this position. Is the case of forced sterilization? No, in many cases that is a measure that was established for some countries, as well the Commission is against that. And concerning that the law is slow, yes, it's true. The law is slow, but what I think is that human rights standard, and now I want to refer to the principle of the human rights law. For instance, when the American Convention was passed in 1969, there was not internet. And now we have internet, we have the American Convention, and we can use the convention to say that, for instance, there is abuses or digital violence through the internet, different access. Actually, Argentina passed a law, internal law, saying that the access of internet is a human rights. It's a human rights. So, and the Commission in the interpretation as well agree that internet technology, whatever, all these issues can be analyzed from the perspective of the human right. Actually, the human right perspective can be used for every situation. Thinking about LGBT marriage, access contraceptive, death penalty, all these issues, everything from the back and now can be analyzed under human right approach. And talking about the pandemic, access to Zoom, access to Meet, to all these platforms, in order to have news, in many cases, it's better to consult, to review Twitter than local media. And if you don't have Twitter, you don't have internet, this is an affect your freedom of information, your access of information. So now there is a thing about the regulation of this. And this is something, of course, the law sometimes is very slow, but the human rights approach help to keep up with this situation. And in the case of vaccine as well, we have this resolution 1/2021, when we analyze the obligation of the states to provide the vaccines without discrimination. No, the commission is subsidiary of the state regulation, but we have this principle of monitoring. So we have some cases on that. I cannot refer to internal cases that we have right now concerning this mandatory thing. I cannot talking about that. But what I can say is that the commission, when we have of these measures that the state start releasing, like for instance, like closing frontiers or discrimination, we analyze that these measures are developed in the framework of the American Convention. Migrant, and I repeat that, was a very good experience to analyze all these things. Because for instance, what we were mentioned, we have these migratory detention centers in the States, in Mexico, wherever. With the pandemic, the risk of contagions, the risk of the sickness was even worse. So we were against this detention center for migrants because migrants are not criminals. And then with the situation of the pandemic, we increase our monitoring thing. And the same with the vaccine, the access of vaccine. For instance, just for finishing, in the case of the Caribbean, as we were mentioned earlier in our conversation that we have in the morning, in many cases, the Caribbean were very concerned about the vaccines, the access to health, and the climate and environmental, the climate change and the crisis. So when we're dealing with all these issues, first of all, the Commission cannot, is subsidiary, but have the possibility of monitoring. So the state give this measure and the Commission can the opportunity to say is go or against the American Convention.
So could you please pass the mic to Commissioner Sala? And then I just remembered when you talked about Zoom and the internet that there are people online. Please, if there are people online and they have questions, please post them in. We must also remember that you're with us in the room, even though virtually. Over to you, Commissioner Sala.
Thank you very much. I just want to just supplement the information provided by my colleague, Commissioner Yulisa from the Inter-American Commission as regard to issues related to abortion rights and the impact of some of the decisions that are happening in the United States with regard to the work we're doing in the African continent. Because just like the Inter-American Commission, also the African Commission, especially the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa, we anchor our work, everything we do on the constituent documents, that is the African Charter and Maputo Protocol. And we all know how significant the Maputo Protocol is when it comes to sexual and reproductive health rights, especially Article 14, which also has provision dealing with the issue of safe abortion under certain circumstances. And since the adoption of the Maputo Protocol, both at the level of the African Union globally and regionally, and also at the level of the Commission, a lot of work has been done in terms of campaigns and making sure that there's full realization of the provisions in the Maputo Protocol. Some of them relate to providing interpretative text by way of general comment. Yesterday, we talked about general comment number 1 and 2. That's zeroed in on Article 14 of the Maputo Protocol, which provides for that. But despite the innovative work that has been done in terms of the normative framework, we all know that when it comes to these rights, it's not only about the law. What is happening on the ground is not very different from what is happening in Latin America, the issues that you raised. So there are a lot of challenges, but there are a lot of wins also, because there's an awareness that is rising in terms of abortion rights. Very little ripple effect, but still it's there. Now, what is the impact of all these things happening in the US? I think what the challenge we're having now is the fact that we're seeing a general clawback on rights affecting women especially reproductive rights of women. And I can imagine the anti-abortion campaign in Africa just feeding on what is happening in the US generally, and actually posing a challenge for us in terms of some of the gains we've made. Just like we talked about COVID-19 and how it caused a lot of problems in some of the existing challenges. But I believe also the win that we have in the challenges that are happening in the US also are going very well for those of us who are working on these rights within the continent, because then it will be like, because normally when you talk about abortion rights, they will say, these are Western issues. They're alien to our culture. Now, even the Western people are now saying, we do not want abortion. And then the judges at that level, the Supreme Court, which is the highest court land in the US, passing such an retrogressive judgment really does not help us in the African continent. And what we say in the human rights and women's rights movement is that we no longer have anyone to look up to. We have to make sure that we fight on our own as opposed to making comparative analysis. So this is what I just wanted to add to the debate in terms, the discourse in terms of issues related to the abortion rights, just to complement the point. Right?
Thank you. Very important addition, Commissioner Mwandenga, and then we come to Oscar. Oscar, I think maybe you need to get the mic for people online.
To echo what she said, is the fact that even though we didn't have a specific resolution with regard to issues related to vaccine inequities and so the challenges that were happening, it actually featured in some of the activity reports, because as commissioners, we have our intersessional activity report related to issues that were raised. And also within the context of the continental conference that we had on the HIV, impact of HIV on people, impact of COVID-19 on people living with HIV/AIDS, the participants actually brought out the issue of the vaccine inequities, issues of consent, what we need to do. So some of us in our activity report, we reiterated that in when we presented the report to the membership. Yes, yes. So these are issues, it came up, but we didn't have any specific resolution in it, but the discourse was there. You see? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in the overall activity report of the commission to the policy organs, okay, very well, it came up here.
Oscar?
I think we opened the door to a lot of topics that we can go in depth, but I think that the legal debate and the political debate are connected when it comes to reproductive rights. We're seeing like a big push to try to kind of reduce protection of rights, and connected with what the commissioner was saying. Thankfully, in the global south, in Latin America, which is a region, we built protection of access to abortion in a constitutional way, connected with economic and social and cultural rights and not just freedoms. And I think it's not that whole idea that DOPS is going to be imported into our region. It's a little bit more complicated. But that doesn't mean that politics will have an impact, right? And that's where we're seeing a lot of pushback. Sometimes I feel it's so incoherent and it doesn't make sense when you see conservative groups advocating for recriminalizing abortion, but also restricting access to comprehensive sexual education and restricting access to contraception. If we really want to reduce instances of abortion, we should open up like sex ed, and we should have access to contraception. So there's really like of course, it's like a dogmatic sort of approach to how we see this, and they have instrumentalized legal arguments to push for their cause. I joined Georgetown January 2008, and there was an event here on this campus happening that it was X year anniversary of Roe v. Wade. I didn't read the small print because it says under it is how to overturn it. So I go to the event, and it was unthinkable in 2008 to even entertain the idea. I mean, maybe for us, maybe on the progressive side, conservatives have a long-term plan built into to get to where they finally got. So I think we should definitely see that we have more robust human rights and constitutional protections on reproductive rights, maybe outside the US, but that we shouldn't take it for granted. right? El Salvador is a good example. We keep talking about a country that had exceptions on their criminal code. Those were repealed. So it's a country that at some point had a much more flexible system than the one it has right now. And in terms of politics, we also need to be very aware of the power, political and economic power the US has. We've been having discussions when, hopefully not in the next 2 years, but if there is a new Republican president, depending on who that person is, we may have the global gag rule instated again, and that expanded version of limiting funding going to organizations that do reproductive rights services. So the impact that has outside the US is also very relevant, and we need to push and be ready for that potential pushback. One small thing, the pandemic, we're still are starting to see the impact it has had in society as a whole. I'm gonna bring to a topic that I mentioned before, but we didn't elaborate much, which is role of corporations and non-communicable diseases. A lot of countries suspended screening of preventable cancers that can be treated early on if they're caught early. The impact that those years of suspension is going to have on the health system as a whole, and increasing costs because cancers are going to be more advanced. I mean, breast cancer, colon cancer, we suspended for years screening and protocols that were established in society. So now we're going to start seeing an increase of prevalence of those diseases. And that's part of that response that we need to build in a cohesive way. I jumped from one topic to the next, but I just wanted to comment on those two.
Thank you, Oscar. We have time for one last question, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists for quick final remarks. So anyone here would like to? Yes, thank you, Tara.
Thank you. Do you think maybe care services or care systems can help to improve health systems and health, especially for women? Or I don't know, how do you think about care services?
Thank you so much for the question, because it's very, very important. And I know, and if you don't know, Tari is researching. I have a book on that, and it's very important because it's very important, this issue, because caring, I mean, working at home, taking care, as I always say, we are here because there is somebody at work taking care of all the other things, no? Well, this was never, this was not understood as a work. It was understood as a women obligation. In Argentina, they published these graffitis about on Women's Day saying, eso que llaman amor es trabajo no pago, meaning that's why they call love is underpaid work, you know, and there was picture of women ironing, cleaning, washing. So changing, incorporated a gender perspective, a human right perspective is basically with caring, because and this was what, when I was investigating, and I'm going to publish an article on that. Imagine a girl who is raised and she has to take care of the brothers, older brothers, you know, helping women with helping moms, taking care of the younger brother and sister, whatever. They grew up with this idea that the obligation, they get married and keep taking care, grandmothers and children. Think about feminicide. Who's taking care of the orphan of the feminicide? Grandparents, especially grandmothers. And then when she's woman is 60 or 70 years old, she doesn't have pension, she has a social plan, she doesn't have anything, and is still caring. So when you put the gender and the human right discourse and analysis in this, you know, you start understanding that society and is developing because of these women taking care of everything. I always, because I am a professor at an American university, and when I meet my colleagues, professors, most of them were men, and I say, you are here, and some of them travel with the wife. They say, well, you are here because now your wife are at the hotel ironing the how do you say, the shirt, or taking care of your family. That's why for women it's more complicated to, you know, to develop our work. So when you start thinking about caring policies, you change the view. For instance, Argentina has policies about the right to be cared and the caring as a job, and you put that in the state obligation. So when you're thinking about caring, this is something important for health, of course, you know. And look, when older people, because of the pandemic, they have this impact, who's taking care of them? People were afraid to go taking care of older people. So linked with that, especially with women, another issue that we didn't mention here, but I think it is important, is mental health. Mental health is something that nobody take care of. Everybody think about the other diseases, diabetes, cancer. What about mental health? What about the impact on people after 2 years of pandemic? You know, insurance, they never cover this treatment, you know, and this attention of mental health is so expensive. So you learn to deal with that. You learn to deal with depression, anxiety, and all these mental situations. So having this right to health, and that is important, the O'Neill Institute work, and we're talking about that, is thinking about all the dimension of health and how the inter-American system, in our case, can respond to that. With our rapporteur, we're working on this as well, the situation of mental health. What about people with this condition that need support for the rest of their life? Insurance doesn't cover, public insurance as either. So we are living with that. So, and pandemic increased the situation, the cases of depression, anxiety, and all these cases were increased, and there was no treatment for that. So we are not thinking, we're not living after pandemic. We are still in pandemic.
Thank you, Commissioner. So now we're going to do a quick round of 1 minute final remarks, starting with Oscar.
So when Commissioner Mantilla was just talking about mental health and how we sometimes don't consider that, right? We overlook that. It reminded me of the physician that actually was a witness of the state in the case of Beatriz, and how he keeps saying, oh, she was sick and she had those other issues, and she was having, maybe there were other complications. And there was one judge from the Inter-American Court that said, you're talking about mental health. It's not like other issues, or she was like those emotional issues that she was going through. No, it was a mental health issue. So something that is often overlooked. Like very kind of quick remarks. This is a panel, we can talk about multiple issues. There's other areas that we didn't even go into, but what I wanted to highlight is, I mean, a civil society, we're that kind of like in between activism and academia, and kind of like try to like serve that role. How can we fill in gaps and support international organizations, governments, NGO in achieving their mission? We all going to in this interaction. There are a lot of opportunities for collaboration. We are opening the space to explore those collaborations with the African Commission. We have been collaborating for years with the Inter-American Commission, not just by bringing people from the Inter-American Commission to work with us, but also by supporting some of the activities. We have a partnership with the Rapporteur on Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights on a specific thematic report. And the idea is to continue that dialogue and that support, and really supporting the organizations where they need that support. Right? Sometimes as civil society, we can be radical. We want to push for a reality that maybe it's aspirational, we're going to get there, but we really need to work with what is possible, dreaming what we want to achieve, but do incremental, more pragmatic approaches, right? Oftentimes we're very quick at jumping in and criticizing the Inter-American Commission because it didn't say A, B, and C, and we criticize governments. And when we do that, we sometimes lose opportunities to really affect change and push the needle forward. So that pragmatism, of course, means that we're criticized from both sides. We're criticized from the conservatives and from the progressive, because we try to navigate some of that. But that is, I think, the idea that we try to bring here. How can we build those strong collaboration and support different mandates and different actors in society so we can kind of move forward? So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Oscar. Over to you, Commissioner Mwandange.
Well, thank you very much. On my part, I would like to say that as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, we are delighted to have been given this opportunity to come and to interact with you. And well, we have learned quite a lot, which is going to assist us in the discharging of our functions. But at the same time, we would also ask that you should take a keen interest in what we do as the African Commission. You can visit our website, look at the materials that there is a lot of information that you are going to get about the work that we do. And we would want that once you get that particular information, you spread the word about what we are doing. But at the same time, if you have any advice that you wish to give us so that at least we can be a better commission, we would be most welcome to receive that particular information and advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Mondenga. Now over to you, Commissioner Mantilla.
Thank you very much. Well, I just want to start saying thank you, a big thank you for this invitation, for being here, and for the opportunity to meet and to have this interaction with my colleague from the African system. We have a lot of issues and plans, and you are going to listen from us. And my colleague that is rapporteur of women's rights as well, because when I saw her, as soon as we met, it was a picture together, because at some point you understand how difficult it is to work in women's rights in Africa, in the Inter-American Sea, wherever you go. And thinking about your first question, when you say what was the biggest success or win, for me, and I'm very open on that, it's not to lose the hope, el no haber perdido la esperanza, even though so difficult, so complicated, so to keep working on this. I consider myself a privileged person because I have the opportunity to work on human rights, to love my work, to keep working on that, especially in women's rights, and to keep working in the commission or wherever I will be, I don't know. So for me, not to lose hope, to still believe in the standards, to still believe that your work in the Inter-American system can change people's life is a privilege. And another win that I would like to have is that maybe some of you or people that are watching in the internet, whoever, you know, decide that they can do that, they can work with a gender approach, with a human right, they can make a little change. You don't have to change the whole world because it's impossible. But maybe a little thing, this for me will be successful. Thank you.
And we don't want to be the ones spoiling the sisterhood, so we'll allow Commissioner Salanje to also have 1 minute reflection.
Thank you very much for that opportunity. Really, acting this has been a very wonderful experience. And I think Commissioner Julissa also, this also reinforces the fact that nothing can replace when we meet physically, because we're part of the same platform and we've never seen each other in terms of interacting. So this has actually brought us together, and it's going to open a lot of doors. We've started talking already, like she rightly observed, and there is room for collaboration. And I want to thank the ONU Institute and the partners for facilitating this, this collaboration. It's very important. And we're seeing the commonalities, we're seeing the learnings and what we can learn from each other and how we can exchange and gain a lot, especially on issues of right to health, women's reproductive health rights, right to abortion rights, and general women's rights. And I like the issue of that came up, and this is a mantra I always have, that women's rights is so private, it goes everywhere. You cannot just say women's rights within the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women. In fact, it's intersectional. It runs across all the mechanisms of our various systems. So I think this is very important. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. What a warm way to note. All I'll do is say thank yous to everyone, starting with our colleagues online, the colleagues in the room, the colleagues who kept the mics going, the amazing communication team at O'Neill that has publicized the event and has gotten people here. And of course, to all of you who have contributed to this, from my very able panelists and all the partners who've worked on bringing this together, from the Dula Omar, from the African Commission, from the Inter-American Commission, from Kerlin, from O'Neill, and from the Legal Center. It's quite a joy for us to start this journey where we want to ensure true, practical, meaningful collaboration between the commissions in Africa, the commissions in the Americas, civil society, academia, and affected communities. So all I'll end and say is watch the space. Bigger things are going to happen. Thank you for joining.